Welcome back to the Saints and Alumni Show right here on WBCR 88.3 The Saint. I'm your host this week, Brandon Murphy, class of 2017 from the Alumni Engagement Office. And this week I'm joined by Jim Williams, class of 1968, retired colonel in the United States military, the chairman of the Pennsylvania Prostate Cancer Coalition, and the 2023 recipient of the American Society of Clinical Oncology Patient Advocacy Award. A reminder to everyone listening today that it's here on the radio, WBCR 88.3 The Saint. It's a bi-weekly show highlighting our Siena community and our Siena Saints, but you can also listen on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, and subscribe to the Siena Alumni YouTube channel to check out the complete selection of shows. But first, Jim, officially welcome to the show. Thank you for sitting down with us today. How are things going?
Brandon, it's good to be with you. Things are going fine.
I was so excited when you first reached out to us a couple months ago via email. Unfortunately, you were unable to attend Alumni Weekend in June, but that was because you were being celebrated for the 2023 recipient that we're going to get to in the second segment. But before we get to that, we kind of want to paint this picture of how you ended up at Siena, your military background, and of course, the process with prostate cancer. So let's take the clocks back to the mid-60s and kind of have our community listen to how you ended up at Siena. You were already completed your undergraduate degree and you were stationed in Oklahoma at the time when you got the call to come lead ROTC at Siena and then complete your graduate degree as well. So for everyone listening, can you kind of just take us back on how you ended up at Siena? What is the military process like to be assigned ROTC and what was the experience like to get here?
Okay, Brandon. Well, I graduated from Westchester State Teachers College in 1959. And of course, I was doing the draft area, and I had used up all my deferments to complete my college degree. And so I was eligible for being drafted. One of the problems for men at that time was that your employer or future employer will ask you if you met your military commitment. So I said, well, let me go do my 2 years and get that out of the way and come back and teach and coach, which was my objective. I tell people I was volunteered for the draft in October 59. I got in the military. I got brainwashed, and it took me 25 years to figure out how to get out of that institution. But anyhow, after basic training and going through officer candidate school, I ended up in Germany during the Cold War, 61 to 64. And upon return from that assignment, I was assigned to Fort Sill, Oklahoma, where I had now decided to stay in the military and where captains completed what they call the advanced course. And since I was field artillery, I would take the advanced course at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, which is the home of the U.S. Army Artillery. After that 1 year schooling there, my next assignment was Siena College in Loudonville, New York. And that was an ROTC assignment. And I was not the head of ROTC. I was an assistant professor of military science at Siena. So in the summer of I'm trying to go back and think how it's been 1,000 years ago.
It had been probably the mid-60s, right?
That's right. In the summer of 1965, I came to Siena College as the assistant professor of military science. And I was there along with 4 or 5 other captains and majors. The organization was run by a major at the time who was called the professor of military science. The college campus was a little different at that time, Brandon. We had, I think, 4 or 5 Quonset huts, if you can imagine that now in 2023. But we had 4 or 5 old Army Quonset huts that sat next to the gymnasium that were the ROTC headquarters. Well, one of the Quonset huts was the armory, where we actually had rifles that the cadets used and parade in. And one was the administrative building. A couple of the Quonset huts were classrooms. And then we also had a Quonset hut that was a rifle range. So the ROTC had a pretty large footprint at Siena at that time.
And I'm so glad that you talked about teaching and coaching. It's almost like you've been on a podcast previously and you're keeping the listeners hooked. And before we get to the other aspects of your time at Siena, like coaching, can you take the listeners through what your role was within ROTC and what the structure was like here on campus in the mid-60s?
Yeah. Well, at that time, the students that were at Siena College were required to participate in ROTC for 2 years. As you know, it was an all-male school at that time. We had no female students, and private schools could get around the commitment of physical education by having an ROTC program on campus. So students did not have to take, quote, PE. In fact, we did not have a physical education program at Siena, but we had an ROTC program. So if you were a freshman or a sophomore, you had to participate in ROTC. And so that were several hundred students who were in the ROTC program. If you decided to go into what was called the advanced course, which was a junior and senior year, and you would be commissioned as a lieutenant in the Army at the end of that 2 years, you could do so. And we must have had maybe 20 or 30 people, men in the junior and 20 or 30 in the senior program at Siena. So on a Thursday afternoon, you would see a cadre of 4 or 5 officers in the active Army, and then you would see 150 or 200 students in military uniforms with their weapons parading and doing other exercises on campus. Can you imagine that happening today?
I can. Campus looks a lot different like that nowadays.
Yeah.
A lot different structure.
Yeah.
And you talk about being so involved within ROTC, over 200 people you're working with on a weekly basis, but you still find time to coach, whether it be cross country, you involved in the rifle club. So you had different experiences at Siena other than ROTC. Can you talk a little bit about the other experiences you had on campus, like country club, like the rifle club, that had a positive impact on your Siena experience?
Well, we had a rifle club at Siena when I arrived there, and I took over as coach of the rifle club, and we expanded the program. And these were men who were in the ROTC program who wanted to increase their marksmanship skills. And we were fortunate that we had undergraduate marksmanship competition throughout the state of New York. And even we were invited to Kingston, Ontario, and competed against the Royal Academy of Canada, where their military schools was located. And we would go up there once a year and compete in Kingston. And can you imagine in a van with 10 or 12 students and 14 or 15 rifles and ammunition, and they'll all just go across the border and no problem, huh?
Yeah, it was, no stops, just go in there real easy, keep it simple.
We would go down to Long Island and compete against the Maritime Academy, and there's no problem, and have a good time. And it, as I say, is quite an art to be a real good spokesperson. I mean, a good skillman, a marksman, and they learned those skills at the Siena. I also started the cross country and track team at Siena, which was new at that time. And we had a fair amount of success, but I was only there for a couple of years. But we did have a cross country team that won some awards, their first team out. And so with that, we were busy. But I also had the opportunity to get a master's degree at Siena. And one of the features of an ROTC assignment for many military people that they are fortunate enough to be on a campus and get a degree. And because they're part of the faculty, there's no cost to them to participate in a master's degree program. Since my undergraduate degree was in education, it was in history and geography on the high school level, I opted for secondary school administration and was able to get that degree at Siena, and was also qualified and got my principal certificate from the New York State Higher Education, although I never used it in New York. Well, I had a busy 3 years at Siena, but it was a rewarding time for myself. The Franciscan monks were very supportive of the ROTC program and helped us promote that program. Can I tell you one war story about my experience there?
Absolutely, absolutely. Share with the community today.
In
there, Jim.
1968, we were in the middle of the Vietnam War, and as you know, that was not a popular conflict in America. And lo and behold, some students who were not in the ROTC program made an appeal to the president to protest and march against the Vietnam War during our annual review. We would have an annual review in late May, right before graduation, where all the cadets would form a formation in the quad, and the president of the university would be honored, and the students would march past the president. Well, there were some, as I said, non-ROTC students who wanted to protest. Well, the Franciscan monks were very supportive of the ROTC program and the discipline and the other characteristics of it. And although they allowed the few students to protest, they put quite a restriction on them. If you read about or were aware of what went on other campuses, students were taking over buildings. There were fights on campus, and unfortunately, in some cases, there were firearms that were discharged. But Siena required that those students who wanted to protest had to be in coat and tie. And there was a monk who was in front of the formation and a monk who was at the end of formation. And it could not be conducted on the parade ground, but it had to be conducted in front of the admin building. So there were quite a distance from what was going on. But it was kind of interesting to see that as conservative and supportive as the Franciscan monks were, they did allow that fraction of the college who were protesting against Vietnam War to have their day. I happened to be the public service officer at the time, and they called the media because they usually came from Albany and photograph and video the ceremony. But on 1968, the news was not the annual ceremony. The news was students protesting on campus. So on that night, you didn't see any of the annual review, but you saw these students in coat and tie who were protesting against the Vietnam War on St. Bernardine of Siena's.
Well, I know we had talked about that briefly in the pre-interview that we had, so I'm glad that you were able to get that in and share that story with the Siena community today. And we got about 3 minutes until we have to cut to commercial break. So we talk about the 3 years that you had at Siena and then the years after Siena. So briefly, what happened after 1968 on the military background side? Where did you go after you left Siena, those next 3 to 5 years?
Well, I left Siena in 1968 and went to Vietnam. And was the Inspector General of the 101st Airborne Division above Da Nang and Hue Phu Bai. I spent a year in Vietnam, came back to Fort Sill, Oklahoma, and was an executive officer for a target acquisition battalion. And Brandon, 1 year to the day, I got orders to go back to Vietnam. So I came back in 69 and I went back in 71, and I went back as the infantry officer. Because I was artillery, and artillery, infantry, and armored are considered the combat arms, and those officers could be interwoven into any of those assignments. So I went to language school to learn the Vietnamese, the Saigon dialect. I went to the John F. K. Insurgency School. And then in 1971, I went back to Vietnam and was inserted with the popular and regional forces in the area south of Saigon in Long An province, and spent a year as the operation officer for the regional and popular forces. Upon completion of that tour, I came back to Fort Leavenworth to go 1 year schooling in Command and General Staff College. And then I had a 3-year tour with Army Recruiting Command in Hawaii. We don't have time to discuss a lot about that now, but Nixon had dropped or eliminated the draft in 1974, and now we had to figure out how this thing called the U.S. Army was going to be sold to the public, because there was no more a draft threat over the heads of young men coming into the service. And so now, instead of just waiting for men to come down to be enlisted in the service to avoid a draft, we now had to sell this thing called the U.S. Army. We've been in that volunteer mode since that time. After that, Simon, I came back to a second ROTC tour at Howard University, which is a predominantly Black school in Washington, D.C. for 3 years. And then I went back to Fort Sill again for my 5th assignment down there as a commander of a artillery basic training unit, and then as the executive officer, and then as deputy commander of the Field Artillery Center. And then my last assignment was in Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, as the SPO, the Security and Plans Operations for the Depot's Systems Command. And then I retired from the Army in 1984. Can you believe that? That's been a long time ago.
Long time ago.
Yeah.
But since then, there also has been a lot that has happened to you. So
Yeah.
although that was your last assignment back then, we know that there's another assignment that you have that you're very close and very passionate about, and that's prostate cancer awareness and advocacy. So after break, we're going to come back, talk about all of that, and all of that is the Pennsylvania Prostate Coalition, and all that you do for them. Stay with us. We'll be right back here on WVCR 88.3 The Saint. Welcome back to the Saints and Alumni Show right here on WVCR 88.3 The Saint. I'm your host this week, Brandon Murphy from the class of 2017 and the Alumni Engagement Office. And this week I'm joined by Jim Williams, class of 1968, retired colonel in the United States military, the chairman of the Pennsylvania Prostate Cancer Coalition, and the recipient of the 2023 American Society of Clinical Oncology Patient Advocacy Award. But before we get to all of the advocacy and education that you're doing there was one last topic we really wanted to touch upon in that last segment before we got to break, and that is the one of the main reasons why you wanted to stay in the military. So Jim, can you provide a little bit of the insight for our listeners today? What was those additional main reasons why you wanted to stay in the military?
Yeah, thank you, Brandon. I had mentioned previously that, I had graduated from college in 1959 and decided to volunteer for the draft to meet that military obligation that many Americans had to do at that time. But the second reason, and then went into the military. But I decided to stay in the military because I received a lot more upper mobility in the military than I did as a citizen. Unfortunately, African-American men and women at that time had little upper mobility as a civilian. When I came out of college, I had credentials to teach secondary education in history and geography, as I mentioned. But as I looked for jobs in the Bay Area, all the superintendents told me that the community was just not ready yet for a young Black male in secondary education. And so I thought by going in the military, meeting that military obligation, I could come out in 2 years and pursue further in that area, in the suburban Philadelphia area where I grew up. But as I say, and Siena was a perfect example by being assigned ROTC, by joining the faculty at Siena, I was able to do those things that I was not able to do as a civilian. I was able to teach as an assistant professor on campus. I was able to coach the young men as we in the rifle team and track and cross country. And as I pursued my career in the military, I would do a lot of things that I was not able to do on the outside. And so that's one of the reasons why I stayed in the military at the time. It just happened, my situation, there was a lot more upper mobility within the military than there was outside.
Well, I'm so glad that you were able to provide some of that historical background of the 60s and the 70s and even the 50s and the historical time period in the United States, and then acknowledge all that the military has been able to do for you and your family and friends as well. And now it's just been over 30 years ago for you, Jim, where a second journey of yours began, and that was with the prostate cancer. And it was for you at the time as a patient. So can you take us back to the early 90s when your journey began, a little bit of the timeline of your treatment, and then ultimately conquering that second phase of your life?
Thank you, Brent. I appreciate that opportunity. I retired in 1984, and the military is a young man's game. So I had 25 years of service, and I was 48 years old when I retired. So what are you going to do for the rest of your life?
Yeah.
And so I went into human resources. I decided I didn't want to have anything more with security or military and guns and bullets, etc. I had done that. I wanted to do something else, and I went in human resources, and human resources was evolving into a discipline. It had been called personnel before, and their main objective was to hire and fire people and take care of payroll. But now there was this new thing called human resources, where you're trying to develop the staffs beyond just the traditional roles of pay officer or hiring and firing manager. And I worked for Montgomery Ward's and Company. I don't know if you remember that, but that was a big box store like Sears.
Yep.
And Sam's, et cetera, that was in existence at that time. And they were the founders of the catalog business in America. And I stayed with them for 5 years and went to the American Bar Association as the human resources director, living in the Chicago area at the time. And the American Bar Association was located on the campus of Northwestern's professional schools in downtown Chicago. In 1991, my wife suggested that I go see our family physician. I had not done so in some time, and as you know, men, we go to the doctor, go when we're well.
Yeah.
I didn't see any need to go to the family doctor because I was a private pilot and quite active at that time, and to maintain my pilot license, I had to get a flight physical every 3 years from a flight surgeon, and I was doing that, but I had not gone to our family doctor. And my wife insisted that since all the children were, and she was, that it would be to our advantage if I also visit our family doctor. And I went to this young doctor who incorporated in the blood work, nothing special, some test called PSA. And that came back with a high number. And I found out that PSA meant the prostate specific adjuvant. The prostate produces this enzyme, a protein called PSA. And when the number is high, it means something's going on in the prostate. Well, anyhow, the standard number was 4, my number was 10. So that meant, something's going on, we don't know, but you need further evaluation. So I went to a urologist, okay? And the urologist did a biopsy. That's a needle biopsy where they take very small samples of the prostate. In fact, the samples are as small as the end of a pencil, so you can see they're very small. But they give it to a pathologist who can put it in a microscope and see whether that prostate cell is healthy or cancerous. And lo and behold, I had prostate cancer. And they can grade those cells, and we're not going into any detail, but from a score from 1 to 10, my score was 7, which meant intermediate. So here I was, a African-American, 55 years old, with a PSA of 10 and cancer that was in the intermediate stages. And my urologist said something strange. He said, I want you to go to Mayo Clinic. Now I'm in Chicago, Illinois, major city in America, outstanding hospitals and specialists. And my urologist was to send me 5 hours away to Mayo Clinic in Minnesota.
Yeah.
And I said, why? He said, well, there's a guy named Bob Myers up there, and they're doing a lot on prostate cancer. And I think you need to go up there. And I want you to go do that. I want you to go see a radiologist because they look at the world differently than I do because I'm a surgeon. I want you to go talk to an oncologist because they deal with all kinds of cancers. And after you do your homework, we'll decide what the next step is. Well, I did that. And I ended up in the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota, fell in love with that place and decided to have surgery at the Mayo Clinic. And my urologist was fine with that back in Chicago. And I knew, Brandon, I was at the right place because there was a sheik from the Middle East who had his private 747 parked at the airport in Minnesota, okay? In Rochester, Minnesota, and had taken over the top floor of the Ramada Inn for his staff. And he was 2 doors down from me in the hospital with a private bodyguard outside. So I figured if it's good enough for the sheik, it's good enough for Jim Williams, right? And so I had surgery at the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota. And my surgeon said that they thought they got all the cancer. They didn't see any residue or any signs of cancer after the surgery, but they said you never know. So he wanted to put me on a second protocol. And I went through a second protocol of 6 months of hormone treatment after the surgery. But the result of that story is, and I also had a TRICARE for Life medical program that I still have because I was retired military that paid for all of that. So I perfect storm as this went, and I thought that was the standard in America, having a primary physician who's on top of his her game, having a urologist or specialist who said, you know, I'm not the only guy on town. You need to look at all your options. Going to a major medical center and having an insurance plan to cover it all. And I found out that my experience was the exception, not the rule. And you would think in America, it would be the rule.
And you bring that up about the exception, not the rule. So can you talk a little bit about some of the grassroots advocacy that you've done through the years? And over the years, you've been involved with 20 different organizations to help bring education and awareness. So can you touch upon a little bit of those two things at the same time, the advocacy and then why you wanted to get involved and why you felt so passionately about it?
Well, I got involved in advocacy, and we saw an advertisement in the local Chicago paper of an organization called Us Two International, which was just forming at that time. But now it's an international organization of men with prostate cancer and supporting them as they go through that journey. But because of my experiences, to say was the exception and not a rule, and being a minority, I wanted to see what I could do to improve that situation in the US. And we have two big elephants when we talk about healthcare in America. One, you're dealing with men who don't see the necessity for annual physical examination, inspection of the body. And secondly, we have not a health plan or healthcare system in America. We have a sick care system. Mm-hmm. So it's driven by diagnosis and treatment. It's called fee for service. And so the professionals are paid for diagnosis and treating. And when you look at treatment and when you look at the TV every day, you see all kinds of advertisements for the blue pill, the red pill, ask your doctor about this, ask your doctor about that. So we have a reactive system in America for healthcare. And that's unfortunate because even with cancer, as much as we know about cancer and as much as we don't know about cancer, we do know that we could save 50% more people with cancer if it was caught early. But that means it's in the prevention stage, the prevention realm, and that means the early stages. And the early stages is before you have any symptoms, and trying to get men to understand they need to go to the doctor when they're well, not wait till they get sick is a hard sell. They take their cars in to get the oil changed, not because the car, but because it's good preventive maintenance. But to sell them that you need to go to the doctor when you're well is a big problem. And so we've been tackling this problem for 30 years, and we've had some help. But selling men's health in America is very, very difficult, and we have not yet been able to make it a positive marketing tool.
And we've got just about 2 minutes left, Jim, and I want to touch upon your responsibilities as chair of the Pennsylvania Prostate Cancer Coalition, what that does, and then to you to close out the show today, what did it mean to you to be recognized for all the work that you have done over the last 30 years?
Well, I'm one of the founders of the Pennsylvania Prostate Cancer Coalition. We're a body of men, women, physicians, survivors, non-survivors, trying to raise awareness for men's health in many ways, through legislation, through presentations. Our slogan is "Don't fear the finger," which is one of the examinations. And there's a lot of controversy about the screening tools. But the bottom line is that in America, if we're going to say number one, we have to be healthy and we have to be educated. We spend tons of money in both of these roles and don't get a good return on those investments because we don't seek more priorities in prevention. I was fortunate this year to be given the American Society of Clinical Oncologists Patient Advocacy Award. That organization is called ASCO. We had 34,000 people in Chicago this year. It's an international organization. And these are people who deal with oncology, cancer, in all its various forms. And these are researchers and scientists and educators and patient advocates who are trying to raise the standard for health in America through research and through patient advocacy. And I was honored to get one of those awards. I just like to say that my experience at Siena was quite rewarding. And I've watched with great joy how the campus and population and programs have expanded since I was there. And as I say, there were very few minorities, only one or two minority students, and I was one of them, and one faculty member at the time, and no females at all on campus. And now as I review the monthly or the periodic journals and information coming out of Siena, I see more girls than I see boys. Yeah. And a lot of minorities from various segments of our population. And this is good.
Well, Jim, I'm so glad that you were able to take the time to speak with us today. I know we could do a segment on your military time, a segment on Siena, and a segment on prostate cancer awareness, but hopefully this will just be the beginning of a conversation for many people listening for advocacy and education as we move forward. And hopefully, as I said in the pre-interview, we get you back here at Siena soon for lunch, to see campus life, and maybe we get to a basketball game or a lacrosse game in the fall. Thank you again. Thank you for serving our country in so many ways that you do. It's been great to talk to you. I hope we stay in touch. And thank you everyone for listening today. We'll see you next time right here on the Saints and Alumni Show.